This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Whether it's a new profession or a lifelong passion, start your journey to website glory with Squarespace. Check out their amazing all-in-one platform through the link in the description below. More on them in just a bit. If you want rock and roll, it is indeed a long way to the top, as AC/DC reminded us in 1975. The life of a rocker in Australia, or anywhere else, isn't easy. But if you wanted to rock in the Soviet Union, let's just say you could add a few more obstacles to that list. While rock fans around the West could enjoy the bouncy, staccato chords of AC/DC and friends, their peers in the Soviet Union were frustrated by the Glavlit, or Central Literary Department. This was the state's censorship organ, which had labeled rock music as morally lax, corrupt, a licentious genre that propagated decadent capitalist ideals. And in the case of AC/DC and even party-loving Kiss, some bands could be branded as neo-fascist. That's right, apparently I want to rock and roll all night and party every day was one of Mussolini's favorite slogans. Eventually, rock performers would find a safe haven, a sort of cultural reservation in Leningrad, today once again known as St. Petersburg. This was the legendary Leningrad Rock Club, the first official venue dedicated to rock music in Soviet Russia. But the journey to get there wasn't an easy one. The long and winding epic of rock in the USSR kicked off in the 1950s. Following Stalin's death on March 5, 1953, his successor Nikita Khrushchev allowed for many convicts of the Gulag system to return home. Many of these happened to be virtuosos of the saxophone, an instrument banned since 1946. With the return of sax, jazz music snuck its way back into the repertoire of folk and popular music bands. Younger Soviet citizens dug the new rhythms and expressed their teenaged angst through frenetic dances, which disgusted the authorities. Premier Khrushchev himself loathed the twist, which he described as an indecent wriggling of certain parts of the anatomy. The wriggling fanatics of jazz were called styliagi, or style hunters. These rebellious youngsters expressed their love of American and Western music through their tight-legged trousers, pointy shoes, loud shirts, and homemade chewing gum made of kerosene wax. Styliagi dudes used to hang out with Styliaga girls, and both were regarded as a moral disgrace, or even worse, traitors of the communist ideology. Their sworn enemies were the Komsomol activists who patrolled dance halls to expel those guilty of outrageous behaviors. To clarify, the Komsomol was short for All Union Leninist Communist League of Youth, which was an organization for people aged 14 to 28 designed to spread communist teachings and prepare future generations of the party. The Styliagi movement did not play or record music of its own, but it did pave the way for future youth subcultures. Ultimately, its most important contribution was to create a clandestine network to reproduce and distribute illegal records imported from the West. With no access to vinyl, they collected old x-rays from hospitals, which made for suitable surfaces for bootlegged phonograms. These bootleg records became known as Röntgenensat, or X-ray records. They were sold under the counter in large department stores or supplied via mail order all over the Soviet Union. This was a risky business indeed when you consider that 3 of the main organizers of this network were sentenced to 2 years of hard labor. In the 1960s, the Styliagi handed the baton to the beatnik movement, which counted a band called Sokol, or the Falcon, amongst its ranks. Active from 1964 to 1969, this was the first all-Soviet outfit to compose rock songs in Russian. Their career ended when all their homemade equipment was either stolen or confiscated. This highlights a major plight constantly endured by the Soviet shredders, a chronic lack of equipment. They made do by recruiting electronics students as ersatz roadies. These unsung heroes plundered phone booths for components, which they repurposed into electric guitar pickups or even amplifiers. As a result, many improvised concerts ended up with the equipment catching fire. I wonder what they would have thought of Jimi Hendrix setting his guitar alight on purpose. In 1966, the first beatnik bands emerged in Leningrad. They could count on the support of many sons and daughters of party officials, the Golden Youth, but their musical careers were destined to be short-lived. Playing rock and roll was not recognized as a proper job. Because unemployment was actually illegal, musicians had to maintain at least one part-time job. Then, once they reached the right age, they had to join the armed forces for 2 years. Finally, if they graduated, they would would be forcibly relocated to take on a pre-assigned job. In other words, there weren't many chances for rockers to actually rock. That said, early bands in Leningrad made the most of their time. They performed regularly in local branches of the Komsomol, which had become more sympathetic to youthful expression. Other authorities were not so understanding, though, and the police regularly broke up concerts and confiscated equipment. If music was one's true vocation, the only way out was to join a VIA, a vocal instrument ensemble. VIAs were Soviet-sanctioned music groups, which played a Soviet-sanctioned folk-pop genre known as estrada and could press records with the Soviet-sanctioned music label Melodia. These songs were still subject to rigorous censorship and focused on romance, camaraderie, and patriotism, conforming to communist ideology and their moral standards. But even when forced into a VIA combo, early rockers managed to sneak in some power chords or Western-imported riffs, gradually paving the way for the rock revolution which was to come. During the 1970s, police repression against improvised rock festivals intensified in Moscow, but controls were somewhat more lax up north in the Baltic republics and in Leningrad. Here, unsanctioned bands coexisted with VIAs, which were becoming more brazen in adopting distinctly Western styles. Influenced by British prog rock bands, they adopted their repertoire, which could be smuggled to tone-deaf authorities as a form of folk jazz classical fusion. Towards the mid-1970s, the UK and US music scenes were reacting to the complexity of prog rock with the aggressive simplicity of punk rock and later new wave. A similar dynamic took place in Leningrad, with a younger generation of rockers embracing the spontaneous do-it-yourself attitude of the Ramones and the Sex Pistols. The forerunners of this movement were Automatic Satisfier, whose singer, known as Prick, was first arrested for urinating on a platform of the Leningrad metro. Leningrad authorities were on high alert for any possible trouble caused by rockers, punk, or otherwise, especially after the events of the Palace Square. On July 4, 1978, crowds assembled in Palace Square after press agency TASS had wrongfully reported that Santana, Joan Baez, and the Beach Boys were due to perform. When Santana and friends did not materialize, the angry crowd started a riot, which was quelled only with water cannons, beatings, and mass arrests. Worried by the escalation of violence, Soviet leadership deployed a ruthless psychological weapon, a Western import which could nullify punk activity: disco music. Performers like Boney M and Donna Summer were invited to the Soviet Union as an alternative to more aggressive music genres. This was also a PR stunt. In the run-up to the 1980 Moscow Olympics, the Soviet Politburo wanted to give an image of the USSR as a fun-loving place. In light of all of this, many bands and promoters began to understand that the solution to achieve some freedom of expression was to set up a proper, permanent music venue, a rock club. But if you want to set up a proper website, then it's time to do it with our friends over at Squarespace. Look, now more than ever, people are getting creative with their time. They're reaching into their savings account to start a new business or maybe launch a new blog. The world really is yours, and Squarespace is the perfect web tool to help you fashion it into whatever you like. It is the platform to use when you're ready to get started on the next web project that you've been thinking about. Are you looking to get in and out quick without thinking too much about what your website should look like? Well, bam, use one of their quick and beautiful templates to make a website that is fresh and for you. Or maybe you're more of a hands-on person. You've got lots of opinions about what exactly your site should look like. Well, Squarespace gives you all of the customization options that you could ever want, with no updates, no patches, no technical BS to worry about. And once you're done setting up your website, tinkering with the design if you're so inclined, or maybe just playing with the colors, there are so many extra features that Squarespace provides so that your website can thrive. Email campaigns, patronage portals, social integrations, member-only areas, analytics, commercial options, 24/7 support. It's everything you could ever want, all in one place. So when you're ready to get started on the next project of yours, big or small, if it involves a website, it's got to be with Squarespace. Right now, you can go to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/geographics and save 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. Let's get back to the Rock Club. The first attempt at creating a space for rock music ended, well, poorly. Leningrad band Sankt Petersburg had planned to set up such a venue. They could not believe their luck when a Komsomol activist approached them wanting to help. If they committed some funds, he would take care of the rest. They did commit their funds, and the activist, who was actually a common scammer, just disappeared with the money. The second attempt in November 1979 was better planned. It came as an initiative of three promoters: Lurie Baidak, Sergei Drizlov, and Tatiana Ivanova. This first incarnation of the club had a suitably bland and bureaucratic name, the City Experimental Club for Contemporary Youth Music Enthusiasts. It was located on Prospekt Energetykovo, a long avenue west of the Neva River, which cuts through the Bolshoyotsinskoye Cemetery. This club could seat an audience of 200, which the promoters must have hoped would be livelier than their corporeal neighbours. The club hosted the first officially approved rock concert in Leningrad, during which 11 bands performed for an audience of delighted rock fans and maybe not-so-thrilled representatives of the Communist Party and the Komsomol. Two bands from that festival, Kronwerk and Zemlyan, were then invited to the 1980 Spring Rhythms Festival in Tbilisi, Georgia, along with seminal group Akvarium. The latter band really made some noise. Akvarium had been signed up thanks to their acoustic set. Once on stage in Tbilisi, however, they shocked the audiences with a wild, electric performance reminiscent of Iggy Pop or the Rolling Stones. Their stage behavior shocked censors, who accused them of inciting homosexuality. Lead singer Boris Greshnikov was expelled from university to satisfy the unemployment laws. He had taken up work as a night watchman. Likely because of the ruckus caused by Akvarium, the club in Prospekt Energetykovo was shut down shortly afterwards in the summer of 1980. The Leningrad youth orphans of their short-lived rock temple did not desist. In January of 1981, two of the founders of the experimental club held a meeting with Anna Ivanova, director of a group called the LMDST that served as a workshop for amateur artists belonging to the Leningrad trade unions. Ivanova agreed to set up a new rock club, remarking that if they sack me from my job, I have a husband who can feed me. And so it was that on February the 7th, 1981, the Leningrad Rock Club, or LRC, was established in the LMDST premises, the Palace of Folklore, on 13th Rubynshtenia Street. At that time, the Soviet premier was Leonid Brezhnev. Ronald Reagan had just been inaugurated as the 40th President of the United States, and the Cold War was still at risk of flaring up. Akvarium was among the founding members, although they did not perform on the club's opening night. The hall could seat a much larger audience of 600, and a special balcony was always reserved for party and Komsomol representatives. Unfortunately for the wildest rock fans, that was part of the deal. If Leningrad youth wanted to rock, they had to accept the watchful eye of the authorities. The big man in charge was Grigory Romanov, first secretary of the Leningrad County Committee. He was firmly aligned to party diktats, sure, but all things considered, he was a reasonably lenient guy. The thing about Romanov was that he was a pragmatist. Decades earlier, the denunciation and imprisonment of Leningrad poet Joseph Brodsky had caused an international incident that was only resolved when Western intellectuals successfully petitioned to have him released to live in the United States. Not wanting a repeat of those earlier conflicts, Romanov developed a plan to establish cultural reservations to maintain a steadier balance between art and the state. The concept of cultural reservation allowed an overview and easier control of unsanctioned cultural production. While allowing for some freedom of expression, it made it possible to exclude individuals who failed to meet artistic or ideological demands. For the system to work, it required cooperation between the LMDST, the rock bands themselves, the Komsomol, and the city authorities. In practice, this meant that older bands and members of the rock club council tended to restrain younger musicians who wanted to test the boundaries of artistic expression, especially through their lyrics. One could argue that this was a case of excessive self-censorship, which negated the very spirit of rock music. But this is understandable, as the rock club's leadership had to navigate the influence of another key player, the KGB. Years later, in 1990, General Kalugin of the KGB's Leningrad division declared that a rock club was organized in Leningrad on the KGB's initiative, its single purpose to keep that movement under control, make it manageable. This was an overstatement, as we know the club was not an initiative of the Secret Service, but it was absolutely true that the Leningrad Rock Club was subject to KGB surveillance. This state of affairs was well known and accepted by musicians and clubgoers alike. Mikhail Feinstein-Vassilev, bassist of the band Kino, declared in 2002, "We decided that instead of being jailed or being hit by a car or being killed or put away, we'd rather join that very same so-called rock club, and we received a stamp that gave the right to perform these songs." The KGB even assigned 3 agents as permanent liaisons to the rock club. One of them, Vladimir Borisov, had quite a restrictive attitude towards censorship. The other 2, known simply as Volodya and Lesha, were far more lenient and enjoyed mingling with the rocking crowds. A similar conflict was mirrored within the administrative council of the club, which was composed of 11 musicians and promoters. One faction, nicknamed the Administrators, wanted to organize activities according to the instructions of the official government concert agency. The Administrators were eventually ousted in autumn of 1982, giving free rein to their opponents, who insisted that the club and its music stay as independent from government organizations as possible. Their main aim was to improve conditions for musicians, giving them access to better sound technology and improving the quality of concert sound. Their first major achievement was the staging of the 1983 LRC Festival, the first proper rock festival in the Russian Soviet Republic. It was so successful that it became an annual event showcasing the club's activities. Any band in Leningrad that wanted to bust some eardrums at the next festival simply had to apply to the LRC Council. Then they had to play their set to the admissions committee, who would decide whether to recommend them for membership. If the committee said "da," the next hurdle was the LMDST, the union's artistic workshop. The band could either perform for them or just submit their lyrics for inspection. If all went well, they would receive the litovka, or sanctioning, and authorization to perform in public. With the big day of the concert approaching, the band would receive a limited number of invitations from the LRC Council to be handed out for free. The rest of the tickets were distributed by the Komsomol. Now, if the tickets were free, well, how could the LRC pay the bands? Well, here's the thing. They didn't. Bands never saw one single kopeck. But rockers always find a way. Musicians found out that LRC tickets were accepted around Leningrad as currency, for example, to use public transport. Others were even more creative. If a performer lived in Leningrad but was officially, say, a resident of Moscow, he or she could still claim travel expenses, which was accepted by the club's rules. The next challenge for a performing band was to secure the proper equipment. Despite the council's best efforts, this was sometimes lacking, and bands had to scramble across concert halls and music schools, borrowing amps, mics, cables, and mixing tables to be returned immediately after the gig. But on the night of the festival concert, things could still go awry. In the main hall, as well as outside, the police presence was constant, considerable, and antagonistic, to say the least. Local policemen actively opposed the LRC activities, motivated by ideology and grudges of a cultural nature. Most policemen were recruited from hard-working youth in rural areas and smaller towns, and they resented the supposed parasitic nature of the idle urban folk. Officers routinely patrolled the crowds, preventing people from dancing during gigs. They reacted to the smallest provocation by harassing, attacking, or arresting audience members and musicians alike. The antagonistic stance was not exclusive to Leningrad. The years 1983 and 1984 saw state censor, Glavlets, and security services apply hostile pressure against the rock and pop scenes. If you remember the state-sponsored disco craze, this had a cascade of unforeseen consequence. The popularity of disco music led to the creation of new venues to dance and spin records, discotheques. These venues were required to translate the lyrics of the songs they played from English to Russian and submit them for censorship and approval. Many discotheque owners preferred to avoid this burdensome red tape, especially as they had to translate the lyrics at their own expense. The alternative was to play local music, already written in Russian. Dance floor enthusiasts shunned the state-sanctioned VIA records, so entrepreneurs resorted to magnetizat. These were cassette tapes copied at home and distributed under the counter across the country. They were the evolution of the X-ray records of the 60s. These mixtapes usually contained compilations of new wave bands hailing from the Leningrad scene, which played catchy tunes with lyrics who spoke to the lives of the average youth. The final link in this chain of consequences is that Soviet authorities suddenly had to face a tide of Western-influenced, unsanctioned artistic expression. Moreover, the tapes were so ubiquitous that the sale of VIA records plummeted. The Ministry of Culture went on the offensive. Rock and pop bands across the USSR were put under strict surveillance. Heavy censorship was applied to their lyrics as well as their appearance. In January 1984, the ministry decreed that bands were required to wear three-piece suits on stage. About 40 groups were disbanded or barred from performing. Some sources report that not a single amateur pop gig took place on a stage across the USSR during the first half of 1984. The only oasis in this desert of blind conservatism was the Leningrad Rock Club. The LRC soldiered on. The unholy alliance with the Komsomol and the KGB may have restricted freedom of expression, but it granted the right to perform. The second festival, organized in May 1984, was a hit. 17 bands competed to receive 3 special prizes awarded by the Komsomol. The first prize for ideological artistic level of performance went to Tambourine. The second prize for constructive creativity was awarded to Manufactura, darlings of the establishment. Finally, hard rock and blues outfit Zoo Park received the Optical Institute Institute's department of the Komsomol's Prize for Audience Sympathies. The subsequent installment of the festival in March 1985 was even more successful. The LRC had to find a larger concert venue to accommodate the audience, borrowing the Komsomol's Palace of Culture. The rock movement in Leningrad was growing, not just in numbers, but also in quality of music and increased desire for artistic expression free of censorship. The LRC Council, always under the eye of the city authorities and KGB, struggled to keep the new scene under control. The new premier, Mikhail Gorbachev, would later lift many state restrictions on censorship, but during 1985 and 1986, song sanctioning was kept strict and disobedience was punished just as before. Once again, the club was split in two factions, with a more conservative group opposing a reformist movement led by council member Andrei Balaka. Balaka felt that the boundaries of the cultural reservations were too tight and expanded the activities of the local rock scene outside the club. He founded an independent music newsletter, RAO, or Rock in Opposition, which explicitly challenged the LRC. Balaka and RAO championed a new generation of bands which mirrored the evolution of rock taking place in the West. Bands like Kino, influenced by British New Wave and post-punk. Their lyrics were not overtly political, but they dealt with perceived Western decadent themes such as desperate love, intoxication, alienation, and a fascination with the night. Other groups like Televizor were more outspoken against state oppression. At the 1986 LRC festival, Televizor shocked officials by performing unsanctioned songs, most notably Your Dad's a Fascist. The council banned them from performing for 6 months. At the end of the ban, they returned to the stage and again sang forbidden songs. Older bands tried to persuade them to return to the fold lest they put at risk the existence of the LRC. The festival of 1986 saw another accident taking place. Audience favorites Akvarium walked on stage only to announce they would not play that night. They were protesting against police brutality taking place in the lobby. Officers had been arbitrarily detaining audience members and musicians. A guitarist, Andrei Otraskin, had resisted arrest only to have his head slammed against a wall. The audience erupted into a roar and started to riot, prompting more police intervention. In the summer of 1987, Soviet authorities launched an offensive against the new, more rebellious scene by targeting another group, Alissa. Its singer, Konstantin Kinchev, was accused of shouting "Sieg Heil" on stage before attacking a policeman. But it was a last-ditch attempt to stem the tide of rock rebellion. Gorbachev's glasnost reforms for openness were underway, and state oppression was easing across Soviet society. Paradoxically, as state pressure on rock started to weaken, the scene began to lose its cohesion. Suddenly confronted with the market laws which regulated the Western music industry, bands became rivals rather than allies against their common enemies in Moscow. The LRC, already divided on the inside, faced the competition of other rock venues which had mushroomed across the USSR. The Leningrad Rock Club, the controversial cultural reservation, staged its last festival to mark its 10-year anniversary between March the 7th and March the 10th in 1991. This was its swan song as the LRC closed shortly thereafter. Nowadays, number 13 on Rubynshtenia Street is home to the Kaleidoscope Hotel, 4.5 stars on TripAdvisor, by the way. But the LRC left a lasting legacy, echoing out as a distinctly modern safe haven where prog rockers and punks could coexist in camaraderie and experiment together. Throughout a disillusioned period where everyday Russian citizens rarely experienced any shred of power or individualism, it was a place where Leningrad iconoclasts and teenagers could enjoy the thrill of a rock tune. Something so simple, yet so forbidden. So I really hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please do hit that like button below. Don't forget to subscribe, and as always, thank you for watching.